1 in 4 people on Earth once woke up under the rule of a single city. For centuries, Rome seemed unstoppable. Its armies marched across continents, its roads connected distant civilizations, its laws shaped the lives of millions, and its influence reached nearly every corner of the known world. It looked eternal. But history has a way of reminding us that no empire lasts forever. Rome didn't vanish after one catastrophic battle or collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it weakened little by little. Every political crisis, every economic mistake, every civil war, and every invasion chipped away at the foundations that had once seemed unbreakable. Most people living through those years never realized they were witnessing the slow death of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Somewhere in a Roman marketplace, a merchant is arguing over the price of grain, unaware that the coin in his hand is worth a fraction of what it was worth a generation ago. Somewhere on a frontier outpost, a soldier is watching the horizon, unaware that the empire behind him can no longer reliably pay him. Somewhere in a palace, an emperor is signing documents, unaware that within a few decades his title will mean nothing at all. None of them know they're living through the end. That's what makes this story so unsettling and so worth telling carefully. Even today, historians continue to debate what truly brought Rome down. Was it corruption from within? Endless political instability? Economic collapse? The growing power of foreign enemies? Or was there never one single cause at all? Perhaps the most surprising answer is that Rome wasn't destroyed overnight. It slowly exhausted itself until the empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean could no longer hold itself together. In this documentary, we'll follow that incredible journey, from the height of Roman greatness to its final days in the West. Along the way, you'll meet emperors whose decisions changed history forever, generals who fought impossible wars, ambitious rulers who tore the empire apart, and remarkable figures who struggled to keep it alive against impossible odds. One of them will be captured alive by a foreign king and forced to live out his final years as a human footstool. Another will unify half of Europe's most feared warriors, only to die on his own wedding night. And one will be a teenage boy, barely old enough to understand what he's lost, who becomes the last man ever to hold the title of Roman Emperor in the West. And by the end, we'll return to the question that historians have argued over for more than 15 centuries. Did Rome really fall? Or did the Roman Empire simply transform into something the world no longer recognized? One thing is certain. It started at the very top, at the height of a glory nobody thought could end. Before we can understand how Rome fell, we need to stand for a moment at the very top of the mountain. Because Rome's collapse only makes sense once you understand exactly how far there was to fall. Picture the Mediterranean world in the 2nd century AD. A trader could leave the hills of Spain, sail past the coast of North Africa, cross into the eastern deserts near the Euphrates, and never once fear a pirate ship, never once need a foreign currency, never once struggle to find someone who understood Roman law. For nearly 200 years, this was simply how the world worked. Historians call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It wouldn't be matched again in scale or stability for well over 1,000 years. This wasn't an accident. It was engineering in every sense of the word. Roman roads stretched over 250,000 miles, built with such precision that some are still walked on today. Aqueducts carried fresh water for dozens of miles across hills and valleys, using nothing but gravity and the kind of surveying genius that modern engineers still study. The city of Rome itself held over 1 million people, a number no city in Europe would see again until the 1800s. Walk through that city at its peak, and the scale alone would have been staggering to any visitor from anywhere else in the ancient world. The Colosseum, rising nearly 160 feet, could seat 50,000 people for a single afternoon of spectacle. Public baths, heated by underground furnaces, offered ordinary citizens, not just the wealthy, hot water, cold pools, and steam rooms on a scale that wouldn't be matched in Europe again for well over a millennium. Free grain distributions kept the poorest Romans fed. Public libraries held thousands of scrolls. This wasn't simply a powerful army with a capital city attached. It was, in every meaningful sense, the most sophisticated urban civilization the Western world had yet produced. But here's what almost nobody realized at the time. Rome's real weapon was never its army. It was something far more dangerous to its enemies and far more valuable to its future: the ability to turn outsiders into insiders. A Gaul, a Syrian, a North African, any one of them could become a Roman citizen, rise through the ranks, command legions, even, in a handful of remarkable cases, become emperor themselves. Rome didn't just conquer people. It absorbed them, rewarded them, and made them believe they belonged to something larger than their homeland ever was. That single idea, that Rome could stretch to fit anyone willing to serve it, is arguably the reason the empire lasted as long as it did. But every engine needs fuel, and Rome's engine had always run on conquest. New territory meant new slaves, new taxes, new plunder to keep the machine turning. So what happens when the conquering stops? When an emperor like Hadrian builds a wall across northern Britain, not to expand the empire, but simply to mark where its ambition finally ran out, the engine begins to slow. Almost nobody notices until it's too late to fix. There was another problem too, one baked into the very geography of the empire. A message from Rome could take weeks to reach the eastern frontier. An emperor sitting comfortably in his palace had almost no real idea what was happening on the Rhine River at any given moment. And the men he trusted to handle it, his generals, far from home, commanding loyal soldiers with no one watching, held a kind of independence that would, in time, tempt more than one of them to reach for the throne itself. Historians sometimes call the 2nd century Rome's summer. Everything before it built toward this peak. Everything after it would be a long, slow negotiation with decline, even though nobody alive at the time believed decline was even possible. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose private writings are still read today, ruled during this golden afternoon. He never doubted Rome's permanence, but when he died in 180 AD, he left the empire to his son, Commodus. And Commodus would open a door that Rome would spend the next 100 years trying and failing to close. Imagine standing in the crowd the day Marcus Aurelius's funeral procession passed through the streets of Rome. Nobody in that crowd could have imagined what was coming. The temples were full, the granaries were full. The treasury, while strained, still functioned. Whatever cracks existed were invisible to the people living their ordinary lives, buying bread, raising children, watching chariot races in the Circus Maximus. That's the unsettling truth about collapse on this scale. It rarely announces itself. It waits until you've stopped looking for it. Commodus didn't just fail to live up to his father. He seemed determined to insult everything his father stood for. Picture the son of the most respected philosopher-emperor Rome had ever produced, stepping not into the Senate to debate policy, but into the sand of the arena itself, dressed as a gladiator, facing opponents who had been quietly instructed, under threat of death, to let him win. He reportedly renamed the months of the calendar after his own titles. He renamed the legions after himself. He had the head of the great statue of the sun god in Rome replaced with his own face. This wasn't simply bad governance. It was a kind of theater, an emperor performing greatness instead of earning it, while the actual machinery of empire quietly rusted in the hands of men nobody had elected and nobody could remove. He renamed the city of Rome after himself. He fought in the arena as a gladiator, in fights rigged so completely that he could never actually lose. While he played emperor as theater, the real work of running 60 million lives fell to corrupt favorites who had no business holding power. In 192 AD, Rome finally ran out of patience. Commodus was strangled in his own bathtub by a wrestler hired for exactly that purpose. What followed wasn't relief, it was chaos. Within a year, multiple generals across the empire each declared themselves the rightful emperor and marched their armies toward Rome. Historians call it the Year of the Five Emperors. It would become a preview of the century to come. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome would burn through more than 20 emperors. Almost none of them died of old age. Most were murdered, not by foreign invaders, but by their own soldiers, their own bodyguards, their own rivals. One emperor, Gordian I, lasted 3 weeks before he was forced out. This wasn't a wounded empire occasionally stumbling. This was an empire devouring itself, year after year, while the rest of the world watched and waited for an opening. And in the east, that opening arrived. The Sassanid Persian Empire had risen to become something Rome's older enemies never were: organized, wealthy, and dangerously ambitious. In 260 AD, they delivered a blow so humiliating it's hard to overstate its impact. They captured the reigning Roman emperor, Valerian, alive on the battlefield. According to later accounts, Valerian wasn't executed. He was kept as a trophy. Some sources claim the Persian king used him as a literal human footstool whenever he needed to mount his horse in front of his own court. Valerian would die in captivity, the only Roman emperor in history ever taken alive by a foreign power. Word of this spread across the empire like a crack spreading through glass. If Rome could lose an emperor like this, what else could it lose? Picture the scene the Romans themselves could only imagine in horror. An emperor of Rome, stripped of his purple robes, kneeling in the dust of a foreign court, forced to serve as furniture for a king he'd once considered beneath him. Roman soldiers who survived the disaster carried that image home with them, and it spread through the legions faster than any battlefield report ever could. An empire that had spent 400 years telling the world it was invincible had just watched its own emperor become a punchline in a foreign palace. Meanwhile, the money itself was dying. Desperate emperors, needing to pay soldiers who might otherwise turn on them, began quietly shaving silver out of Roman coins. What was once nearly pure silver became, within decades, a coin that was more than 95% worthless metal dressed up in a thin silver wash. Prices spiraled. Merchants stopped trusting prices they'd quoted only days before. The empire's own currency had become a lie everyone could see through. Picture a soldier receiving his pay at the edge of some distant frontier, biting into the coin out of old habit, the way soldiers had for centuries, only to feel it flex and bend in a way real silver never would. That soldier now knows in his hand something his emperor refuses to say out loud. The empire is broke, and it's hoping nobody notices before the next payday. Trust, once lost at that scale, doesn't come back with a new decree. It has to be earned all over again, coin by coin. And Rome no longer had the silver to do it. And when the center can no longer be trusted, the edges start to break away. In the 200s and 60s, an entire breakaway state, historians call it the Gallic Empire, split off, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain completely independently, with its own emperors, its own coins, its own army answering to no one in Rome. At the same time, in the east, a warrior queen named Zenobia, who claims descent from Cleopatra herself, carved out an empire of her own, the Palmyrene Empire, spanning Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor. For a brief, terrifying stretch in the 260s, there wasn't one Roman Empire. There were three. Zenobia herself deserves a moment here, because she wasn't some minor provincial rebel. She was fluent in multiple languages, reportedly studied philosophy, and rode alongside her own soldiers rather than watching safely from behind them. When she looked east toward Persia and west toward Rome, she saw two exhausted giants and one clear opportunity. And for a few remarkable years, she took it, ruling a breakaway empire that stretched from the Nile to Asia Minor, as though Rome had never existed at all. It took Rome's best remaining general to remind her that it still did. It took a soldier named Aurelian, a man history would come to call restorer of the world, to drag the pieces back together by force. He captured Zenobia. He crushed the Gallic Empire. And he did something almost unthinkable. He built new defensive walls around the city of Rome itself, the first in over 500 years. Think about what that means. The capital of the known world suddenly needed walls. The crisis eventually stabilized, but the empire that came out the other side was not the empire that went in. And one man was about to admit, out loud, what everyone already suspected, that a single ruler in a single city could no longer hold this thing together alone. Think about the psychological weight of that admission. For nearly 300 years, Rome had told itself a story. One senate, one people, one emperor, one eternal city at the center of it all. Now that story was about to be rewritten by necessity, not by choice. And once an empire admits it needs two thrones instead of one, it has already taken the first step toward becoming two empires instead of one. His name was Diocletian, and he came to power in 284 AD, understanding something his predecessors had refused to accept. Rome had simply grown too large for one man to defend, so he split it. Not the empire itself, not on paper, not in law, but the burden of ruling it. Two senior emperors, called Augusti, two junior emperors beneath them, called Caesars, each one responsible for defending a different corner of an empire that no longer fit inside a single pair of hands. It was an admission of weakness disguised as a solution, and it planted a seed that would, a century later, grow into something far more permanent. Diocletian didn't stop there. He rebuilt the tax system. He restructured the army. He tried, and largely failed, to freeze prices across the empire by law, only to watch merchants simply stop selling rather than sell at a loss. Some reforms held. Others collapsed the moment they met reality. Picture the scene in some provincial marketplace when Diocletian's price edict first arrived, nailed up in the town square for everyone to read. Shopkeepers who had spent years adjusting to runaway inflation were now being told, by imperial decree, that raising prices further was a capital crime. For a few months, some obeyed out of fear. Then the shelves started emptying, because no farmer would haul grain to market at a legally fixed loss. Within a generation, the edict was quietly abandoned, a monument to how even an emperor with absolute authority couldn't simply legislate an economy back into health. And then Diocletian did something almost no Roman emperor had ever done before him. He retired, willingly, alive. His careful four-man system didn't survive him. Civil war returned almost immediately, and out of that chaos rose a general who would reshape the empire more than anyone since Augustus himself, Constantine. Constantine changed everything, twice. First, in 313 AD, he legalized Christianity, a faith that had been outlawed and, at times, brutally hunted for nearly 300 years. Within a few decades, it would go from persecuted minority to the empire's dominant religion, reshaping its laws, its art, its politics, its very sense of itself. Second, he built a new capital from nothing, on the site of a minor Greek trading town called Byzantium, sitting exactly where Europe touches Asia. Constantine raised a city built to rival Rome itself. He named it after himself, Constantinople. Dedicated in 330 AD, it had its own senate, its own forums, and eventually walls so strong that enemies would break themselves against them for 1,000 years. Constantine reportedly walked the boundaries of the new city himself, marking out where its walls would rise. And when his advisors asked how much farther he intended to go, he is said to have answered only that he would keep walking until the one who guided him decided to stop. A story later Christian writers loved to tell, whether or not it happened exactly that way. True or not, it captures something real about the ambition behind the project. This wasn't meant to be a provincial outpost. It was meant to be a second sun in the Roman sky, and within a century, it would outshine the first. Why build it there? because that's where the danger was. The Danube frontier, the Persian border, the trade routes that actually mattered now. Rome, meanwhile, was drifting towards something it had never been before, irrelevant to its own defense. By the end of the 4th century, under an emperor named Theodosius, what had been practical became official. In 395 AD, he split the empire between his two sons. Arcadius took the east, ruling from Constantinople. Honorius took the west, ruling from Rome, and soon after from the safer walls of Ravenna. This is the moment historians point to as the true birth of two Romes. One of them, the Eastern Empire, which we now call Byzantine, though its people always simply called themselves Roman, would survive for another 1,000 years, falling only in 1453. The other would not survive even one more century. Why? The East was richer, fed by the fertile Nile and the farmland of Anatolia, and its capital was nearly impossible to besiege. The West bordered something far more dangerous, a frontier along the Rhine and Danube, where entire peoples were now on the move, pushed by forces the Romans didn't yet understand, and were about to meet up close. For now, though, both halves of the empire still called themselves Roman. Both still sent envoys to each other. Both still believed, on some level, that this was a temporary arrangement, a practical fix for an unusual moment. Neither side yet understood that they were watching the birth of two entirely separate futures, one that would last another 1,000 years, and one that had less than 100 left. Somewhere on the Central Asian steppe, a people the Romans would come to call the Huns began moving west. Nobody knows for certain why. Drought, shrinking pasture land, competition for territory with rival tribes. Whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. An entire chain reaction of terrified, displaced peoples slamming into Rome's northern border, all at once, all desperate for the one thing Rome could offer: safety inside the frontier. The Goths felt it first. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Gothic refugees arrived at the Danube River, fleeing the Huns behind them, and begged Rome for permission to cross. Rome said yes. Imagine that crossing. Families wading through a river with everything they owned strapped to their backs, having already watched their homeland disappear behind a wave of Hunnic horsemen they couldn't outrun. They weren't invaders when they arrived. They were refugees, desperate enough to hand over their weapons, their children, anything Rome demanded, just for the chance to live inside the empire's protection instead of outside it. Then, Rome ruined it. Corrupt local officials exploited the starving refugees for profit, reportedly selling them dog meat at extortionate prices while their own people went hungry. Some accounts describe desperate Gothic families being forced to sell their own children into slavery just to afford food that should have been provided freely. Desperate, betrayed, and already armed, the Goths did the only thing left to them. They rebelled. In 378 AD, at a place called Adrianople, a Roman army that should have crushed them instead was annihilated. The reigning emperor, Valens, died somewhere on that field, his body never definitively found. A Roman historian writing shortly after compared the disaster to Cannae, the legendary defeat against Hannibal 6 centuries earlier. Adrianople proved something Rome could never unlearn. The legions that once seemed unbreakable could be broken by the very people Rome's own cruelty had pushed into rebellion. From here forward, Rome leaned more and more on barbarian soldiers to fill its own ranks, trading land and payment for muscle. It solved an immediate problem and created a permanent one. Many of Rome's last great generals weren't Roman by blood at all. They were Romanized barbarian commanders, leading armies loyal first to them and only conditionally to the emperor. And the pressure never stopped building. In 405 and 406 AD, entire peoples, Vandals, Alans, Suebi, crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul, overwhelming what little defense remained. Roman Gaul began to unravel. Roman Spain began to unravel. By 410 AD, Rome told the desperate Britons the legions could no longer protect them at all, ending nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule on the island with a single letter. Try to imagine receiving that letter. Generations of your family had lived, married, and died as Roman citizens. Roman coins in your pocket, Roman roads under your feet, Roman soldiers, however thin in number, standing between you and whatever waited beyond the frontier. And then, one day, a message arrives telling you that protection is over, that from now on, you're on your own. For the people of Britain in 410 AD, the fall of Rome wasn't a distant historical abstraction. It was a specific, terrifying Tuesday. Then came the moment that broke something no army ever could. In August of 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric marched into the city of Rome itself and sacked it. The first time in 800 years a foreign army had done what generations of Romans had believed impossible. For 3 days, fires burned in a city that had stood untouched by foreign hands since before anyone could remember. Ancient temples that had witnessed the entire rise of the empire watched it happen. Some Roman aristocrats fled with whatever they could carry. Others, according to surviving accounts, were spared by Alaric's own soldiers because they had taken shelter inside Christian churches, which the Visigoths, themselves Christian, largely respected. Even in catastrophe, the old world and the new one were already tangled together. Rome wasn't even the empire's real capital anymore. That title belonged to Ravenna and Constantinople. But symbolically, the sack of Rome detonated across the ancient world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said he was too stunned to speak, that the city which had conquered the world had itself now been conquered. The city survived, the illusion did not. If Rome could fall, nowhere was safe, and the next threat to prove it would be the most feared name in the ancient world, Attila. Roman ambassadors who met him face to face described a man who lived with almost no luxury, despite ruling over vast, plundered wealth, eating from wooden plates while his own commanders ate from silver, as if daring anyone to mistake him for soft. That restraint made him more frightening, not less. This was not a king who could be bought off with gold alone. He wanted submission, and for years, both halves of the Roman world paid him exactly that, in tribute, just to keep him looking somewhere else. Through the 440s and into the 450s, Attila the Hun united the fractured Hunnic tribes into a single, terrifying force, raiding deep into both halves of the empire, extracting tribute through pure fear, and annihilating any city that dared resist. In 451 AD, a fragile coalition of Romans and Visigoths, led by the general Flavius Aetius, finally stopped him at the Catalonian plains, one of the last true Roman victories the West would ever win. It wasn't enough. The next year, Attila invaded Italy anyway. Only his own sudden death in 453 AD, reportedly from a burst blood vessel on his wedding night, spared Rome from whatever came next. By now, the Western Empire barely controlled anything beyond Italy. Britain, gone. Gaul and Spain, ruled in all but name by Gothic and Frankish kings. And in 439 AD, the Vandals captured Carthage in North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, the grain supply that fed Italy itself. Losing North Africa wasn't just another defeat on a map. It was the food disappearing from the table. Picture the docks of Rome's port city, Ostia, in the years after Carthage fell. Ships that had once arrived reliably, loaded with grain from North African estates, simply stopped coming. Bakeries that had fed the capital for centuries began rationing flour. The free grain distributions that Roman emperors had used for generations to keep the city's poorest citizens fed and, not incidentally, loyal, grew thinner and less reliable. An empire cannot feed its capital on prestige alone, and Rome's prestige was the only thing it had left to offer by this point. The Western Roman Empire, by this desperate point, had become less a genuine functioning empire and more a rapidly shrinking Italian peninsula, propped up almost entirely by powerful barbarian generals acting in the emperor's name.
its actual emperors increasingly reduced to powerless figureheads controlled by whichever warlord happened to command the strongest private army at any given moment. A surviving Roman administrative document from this period, known today as the Notitia Dignitatum, gives modern historians a rare, almost bureaucratic window into just how far the rot had spread by the early 5th century. It lists official military units, garrison postings, and command structures that were still, on paper, supposed to exist across the empire's provinces. But when historians cross-reference the document against other surviving evidence, a troubling pattern emerges. Units listed with full pay and full strength that appear, in reality, to have existed only in the paperwork, their soldiers long since unpaid, disbanded, or never recruited at all. Imagine an empire's own government no longer able to tell fiction from fact in its own military records. That's not decline. That's an institution that has already, quietly, stopped believing its own story. Even the general who had saved Rome from Attila didn't survive to see what came next. Flavius Aetius, the one man who had actually beaten Attila in open battle, was murdered in 454 AD by the very emperor he'd served, Valentinian III, who feared his general had grown too powerful to control. A Roman official reportedly told the emperor afterward that he had just cut off his own right hand with his left. Within a year, Valentinian himself was dead too, killed by soldiers loyal to the man he'd murdered.
Rome's last great general and its emperor had destroyed each other. What was left of the throne was now up for grabs, and the men circling it weren't statesmen. They were warlords who happened to still call themselves Roman. Picture it from the outside for a moment. A frontier stretching 1,000 miles, manned by soldiers who no longer felt Roman, paid by a treasury that could no longer afford them, defending an emperor who could no longer even choose his own generals. This is what decline actually looks like up close. Not a single dramatic collapse, but 1,000 small failures, each one making the next one easier. And every failure had a name attached to it, a face, a family watching from the sidelines, wondering who would betray whom next. By the 400s and 70s, the title Western Roman Emperor meant almost nothing. Real power belonged to whichever general commanded the strongest private army. Men who placed puppet emperors on the throne and removed them again whenever it suited them. It hadn't always been this openly cynical. Just 2 decades earlier, Rome still had one man who might have held the line: Flavius Aetius, the general who had stopped Attila at the Catalonian plains. But in 454 AD, the emperor he served, Valentinian III, grew convinced that Aetius had become too powerful, too popular with his own troops, too dangerous to keep alive. Valentinian summoned Aetius to the palace and personally struck him down. A Roman court official reportedly told the emperor afterward that he had just used his right hand to cut off his left. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by soldiers loyal to the man he'd murdered. Rome's last great general and its emperor had destroyed each other over nothing but suspicion, and there was no one left of Aetius's caliber to replace him. For nearly 2 decades, that man was Ricimer, a Germanic general who installed and deposed 5 different emperors in a row, ruling Italy in everything but title. Ricimer never once tried to become emperor himself. He understood, better than anyone, that the actual title had become worthless, a target for assassins rather than a source of real power. Why wear the crown when you could simply choose, and later discard, whoever did? By the time his successor took over, the idea of a real Western emperor had already been treated as disposable for an entire generation. That successor was Odoacer, and the emperor he inherited was a boy. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name almost too poetic to be real. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome. Augustus, its first emperor. Combined, by fate or by cruel irony, in the name of the teenager who would preside over the end of it all. He'd been placed on the throne by his own father, a military commander, purely as a convenient figurehead. Constantinople never even recognized him as legitimate. In 476 AD, Odoacer's soldiers demanded what soldiers had been demanding for decades: land in Italy in exchange for service. When Rome's remaining government refused, Odoacer didn't hesitate. He crushed the boy's father in battle and deposed the emperor himself. He didn't kill him. Romulus Augustulus was considered too young, too harmless to bother executing. He was given a pension and quietly shipped off to a villa near Naples, disappearing from history entirely. The last Western Roman emperor, ending not in a blaze of glory, but in exile and silence. We don't know exactly how old he was. We don't know exactly how he died, or when, or whether he ever understood the full weight of what his name had come to represent. History simply lets him walk off stage. Then Odoacer did something almost more symbolic than the deposition itself. Rather than crown a new puppet emperor, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the symbols of power, to Constantinople. The message was unmistakable. The West didn't need its own emperor anymore. Odoacer crowned himself king of Italy instead, ruling in the Eastern emperor's name, but answering to no one. Somewhere in Constantinople, imperial officials unpacked a crate containing the crown and ceremonial robes of a 500-year-old office, sent by a Germanic warlord who felt no need to even pretend the title still mattered. It's worth sitting with how strange that moment must have felt on both ends. In the West, a conquering general quietly closing the books on an institution older than anyone alive could remember. In the East, an emperor receiving, by courier, physical proof that half of what Rome had once been no longer existed as a government at all, only as a memory, boxed up and shipped home. There was no final battle for the city of Rome, no last stand at the gates. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of humanity didn't end with an explosion. It ended with a pension. Most people alive at the time barely noticed. It would take historians, writing centuries later, to look back and mark 476 AD as the line between the ancient world and everything that came after. The Eastern Empire, safe in Constantinople, simply continued, still calling itself Roman, still speaking of emperors for another 1,000 years. In some sense, Rome had simply packed up and moved east. But the West, the Gaul, the Spain, the Britain, the Italy that had once answered to a single law under a single name, had shattered into the kingdoms that would slowly become medieval Europe. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Anglo-Saxons. Rome, as the world had known it for 500 years, was gone. So why did it actually happen? Historians have spent over 1,000 years arguing, and they still haven't agreed. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon blamed Christianity, arguing it softened Rome's old warrior spirit, trading earthly glory for spiritual salvation. Most historians today think that's too simple. But something about Roman identity truly did change as the faith spread, and that shift mattered more than we might assume. Gibbon wrote his account sitting in the ruins of the Roman Forum itself, watching Franciscan monks sing in a temple that had once been dedicated to Jupiter, and the image apparently struck him hard enough to occupy him for the next 20 years of his life. Whether or not his specific theory holds up under modern scrutiny, his instinct was right about one thing. The Rome that fell in 476 AD was not, spiritually or culturally, the same Rome that Marcus Aurelius had ruled 3 centuries earlier. An empire's soul can change long before its borders do. Others point to money, an economy addicted to slave labor, crushing taxes on peasants who had less every year, a currency debased so many times that nobody trusted it anymore. Others point to the army itself, an army increasingly filled with barbarian soldiers whose loyalty was rented, not earned, replacing the citizen legions that had built the empire in the first place. And in recent decades, scientists have added something nobody expected. Ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from the Alps reveal a period researchers now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. a sudden cooling beginning in the 530s, likely triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, arriving right alongside crop failures, plague, and fresh waves of migration. Rome's collapse, it turns out, may not have been purely a human story at all. Nature may have been quietly rigging the game the entire time. Contemporary chroniclers writing in the 530s and 540s described something genuinely eerie, a sun that seemed dimmed, sometimes for the better part of a year, its light strangely muted, its warmth noticeably absent even in seasons that should have been temperate. We now understand this as the atmospheric aftermath of massive volcanic eruptions, likely more than one in quick succession, throwing enough ash and sulfur into the stratosphere to measurably cool the planet for years. Harvests failed across an already strained empire, and close behind the failed harvests came the plague of Justinian, a pandemic some historians estimate may have killed a quarter of the population in the regions it struck hardest. History rarely hands out single causes. Sometimes it hands out several disasters at once, arriving in the same decade, each one making the others harder to survive. There's a deeper argument too, one that questions the very word fall. Roman law didn't disappear in 476 AD. It was copied, preserved, reissued by the very kings who'd replaced Rome. Latin didn't die. It became Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people who've never heard of Romulus Augustulus. Maybe Rome didn't fall so much as it dissolved. The way a river doesn't end at its delta, it just spreads out and keeps flowing under a different name. But not every historian buys that softer version. Brian Ward Perkins looked at the archaeology and found something that reads less like transformation and more like collapse. Pottery got worse. Buildings got cruder. Trade routes that once moved goods across 1,000 miles simply vanished. Even cattle bones from post-Roman Britain are measurably smaller than Roman-era cattle. Proof, in bone, that basic knowledge itself had been lost, not merely rebranded. Think about what that single detail actually means. Somewhere, generations of careful, selective breeding, the kind of patient agricultural knowledge passed down from farmer to farmer over centuries, simply stopped being practiced, or stopped being possible, in the chaos that followed Rome's withdrawal. Nobody wrote a document announcing, "We have now forgotten how to breed large cattle." It just happened, quietly, in fields across Britain, leaving nothing behind but smaller bones for archaeologists to measure 1,500 years later. A silent, physical record of exactly how much was actually lost. On the other side, historians like Peter Brown argue that focusing purely on broken pottery misses what actually survived: the institutions, the language, the legal memory that Europe would spend the next 1,000 years quietly rebuilding itself around. Both sides are looking at the same evidence. They just can't agree on what it means. And maybe that's the most honest answer history can give us. There was no single archive waiting to be discovered that would settle this once and for all. There was only ever interpretation. Consider what that really means. Two historians can stand in the exact same Roman ruin, examine the exact same broken pottery shard, read the exact same surviving letter, and walk away having witnessed two entirely different stories. One sees catastrophe. One sees continuity. Both are trained, both are careful, both are, in their own way, right. That's not a flaw in the historical record. That's simply what it looks like when a civilization doesn't end with a single full stop, but fades across 100 different endings happening in 100 different places at once. What's not up for debate is the scale of what Rome left behind. Roman law still underpins legal systems across Europe and Latin America today. Roman engineering set standards Europe wouldn't match again for 1,000 years. And the Colosseum still stands, worn but recognizable, walked on by millions of tourists a year who are standing on the exact same stones where gladiators once fought for their lives. But statistics and senates only tell half the story. What did all of this actually feel like for the people living through it? For a wealthy senator in Gaul, the fall of Rome might have simply meant the tax collector stopped showing up, and that safety now came from a local Gothic king instead of a distant emperor in Ravenna. Many Roman aristocrats never experienced a violent conquest at all. They simply switched loyalty to whoever could actually protect them, because that's what Roman citizens had always wanted from Rome in the first place. Some of these senators barely changed their daily routine at all. They still wrote letters in polished Latin. They still hosted dinner parties discussing philosophy. They still styled themselves as men of culture and refinement, even while writing to Gothic kings as their new protectors instead of Roman emperors. Reading their surviving letters today, historians are sometimes struck by how normal everything sounds, as if the writers themselves hadn't quite realized yet that the world they were describing no longer technically existed. For a farmer in North Africa, after the Vandals took Carthage, the field still needed planting the next morning. The new rulers, like conquerors everywhere, wanted the harvest to continue. The uniform on the tax collector changed. The rhythm of the season often didn't. For someone living in the city of Rome itself after 410 AD, the change was impossible to ignore. A city that once held over 1 million people shrank decade after decade as grain shipments from Africa dried up, as wealthy patrons fled to safer country estates, and as the aqueducts that once fed the great public baths slowly cracked and dried without anyone left to fund the repairs. Picture walking through the Roman Forum a generation after the sack. Past marble buildings still standing, still magnificent, but half empty, echoing instead of bustling. Grass beginning to grow between paving stones that had once seen the busiest foot traffic in the ancient world. This wasn't a city that had been burned to the ground. It was a city that had simply, quietly, been abandoned by its own future. For the soldiers themselves, increasingly barbarian recruits fighting under a Roman banner, the idea of dying for something as abstract as Rome had quietly stopped making sense. What mattered now was the general who actually paid you, your own people, whoever seemed most likely to deliver on a promise of land. This might be the most overlooked truth in Rome's entire collapse. The empire didn't just lose battles, it lost the loyalty of the very people it needed to win them. Imagine standing in the ranks of one of these final Roman armies. Half your fellow soldiers speak a Germanic dialect at home. Your commanding officer has a Gothic name. The emperor, whose face is stamped on your pay, when you're paid at all, is a face you'll never see, and a name that means nothing where you grew up. What exactly are you fighting for? By the 5th century, for a great many Roman soldiers, the honest answer was simply, whoever pays me next. And in the middle of all this, something else was rising to fill the void. As Christianity became the empire's dominant faith, bishops increasingly stepped into roles the crumbling state could no longer fill. Feeding the poor, negotiating directly with invading kings, holding cities together through sheer moral authority when Roman administration no longer could. More than once, it was a bishop, not a general, who talked a city out of slaughter. Pope Leo I himself reportedly rode out to meet Attila in person in 452 AD, when the Hunnic king was poised to march on Rome. We don't know exactly what was said, and so did Rome really fall? In the narrowest sense, yes. The office of Western Emperor ended in 476 AD. A city that once held over 1 million people and ruled a quarter of the human race became a shadow of what it had been. But in a deeper sense, Rome never fully disappeared. Its laws, its language, its roads, its very idea of what government could be, all of it kept moving forward, quietly reshaping Europe for the next 1,500 years. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in modern Madrid, In Paris, in Bucharest, people are speaking languages that grew directly out of the Latin spoken by soldiers marching those Roman roads. Somewhere in a courtroom in Buenos Aires or Milan, a judge is applying legal principles first written down by Roman jurists who never once imagined their words would outlive their empire by 2,000 years. Rome's armies are gone. Rome's emperors are gone. But in ways most of us never stop to notice, we are still in small, quiet fragments, living inside what Rome built. Maybe the real question was never, why did Rome fall? Maybe it's, why did it take so long? An empire this vast, facing economic collapse, endless civil war, plague, climate disaster, and mass migration on every border at once, by almost any measure, it should have broken apart centuries before it did. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air for every civilization that came after it, including, perhaps, our own. If an empire this powerful, this advanced, this utterly convinced of its own permanence, could still come apart from the inside, what does that say about the ones we're living in right now? We'll leave that with you. And next time, we're heading somewhere the ocean itself swallowed the evidence before anyone could even ask the question. Deep beneath the Pacific, off the coast of Japan, where divers found something that, by every conventional account, simply shouldn't exist. That's next on Histosight.